Hello there. We must keep pushing this. Don't let them hide the truth of when, how and where the health emergency originated. So it was all lies then. A small group of scientists decided to quickly change their tune, get published in a peer-reviewed journal, and so give governments around the world the disinformation ammo that they needed to keep the masses down. And use their authority to shut down any discussion of the true origins of this hideous phase of history, as well as prevent the use of cheap, well-established medicines in favour of newly fabricated stuff at huge prices. On the 8th of March this year, a subcommittee of the US House Committee on Oversight and Accountability heard evidence that points to what I can only describe as a sort of conspiracy to mislead the authorities and the public. The subcommittee met under the chairmanship of Republican Dr. Brad Westrup and heard from Dr. Robert Redfield, the former head of the US CDC, Dr. Jamie Metzl, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, Nicholas Wade, the former science and health editor of many prestigious organs including Nature, and Paul R. Werter, MD from the Infectious Diseases Society of America. And what came out was nothing short of breathtaking, and a certain Dr. Fauci has a lot of explaining to do. The pharmakeia is found out. The committee itself is looking at where the latest health emergency originated from, and more fingers are pointing at US money in a Wuhan lab with Fauci somewhere at the centre of it all, and the words gain of function keep cropping up while everyone bemoans the lack of an intermediary host that would back up the Fauci story. And the committee chairman made no bones about stating that this work of getting to the bottom of it all is fundamental to how they deal with the next event. And it looks to me like some involved at the very start of it are trying now to divert attention away from the most likely cause. And the first alarm bell was when Dr. Redfield said he had been suddenly excluded from a group of scientists in early 2020 after saying that both the natural cause and the lab cause should both be investigated fully. And that group that had previously said the lab theory was very plausible suddenly shut debate down within a tightly controlled group with the one almost overnight agreed message that it was caused naturally. A message that Redfield did not agree with, but Fauci did. They squashed the debate, said Redfield, in order to push the natural wet market narrative as hard as they could. And he went on to say that as far as he's concerned, the US National Institutes of Health, the State Department, the US Agency for International Development, and the Department of Defense were all involved in the funding of related gain of function. Now that's a big wow moment. And then it emerged from questioning that the media has been used to push this natural origin narrative, and that the peer review process is actually part of the problem that keeps the truth out of the equation, in that it forces those who want funding to keep dissenting voices away from their pet projects. Probably why Dr. Redfield suddenly found himself ostracised from that group. And when the four witnesses were asked whether or not there was enough evidence around at the time in February 2020 to unequivocally state in a scientific paper that this could not have come from a lab, 3 out of 4 of them instantly said no, with one effectively abstaining. And in the UK, we seem to have an entire establishment doing all they can to sweep the last 3 years under the biggest mat they can find. But one MP who's asking questions is Andrew Bridgen, and he's due to be on his feet in the House of Commons again today, talking about a related issue. So France is in a meltdown. President Macron has decided that democracy gets in the way of good governance and taken the decision to push through his pension reforms by diktat rather than a parliamentary vote. He must have thought he'd lose that vote then. This new law will incrementally increase the French pension age from 62 to 64, quelle horreur, by 2030. But even though this was in his election manifesto, he just can't carry the majority of the French people with him on this. He lacked both the leadership and the judgment on this issue. I mean, pushing this when there's a cost of living crisis going on? What did he expect? You'd think he would know the mood of his own countryfolk, wouldn't you? And predictably, this has sparked a wave of protests across the country and over 300 arrests. The people of France are not impressed in the face of what can only be classed as a show of arrogance by Emmanuel Macron. And now he has the choice. Try to look strong by forcing it through with the help of police action on the streets, or cave in to popular demand and become a much weakened president. This could well be a very torrid weekend for Macron. And after being told that the Swiss National Bank had saved Credit Suisse from oblivion yesterday, we see another slide in the bank's shares. So it's not all over quite yet for Credit Suisse, despite £44.5 billion of Swiss money available to it via the Swiss Central Bank. But now we learn that the chairman of Credit Suisse, Axel Lehmann, is facing 3 class actions for allegedly misleading shareholders in recent months. But in more banking news, we see that a group of big banks has decided to club together $30 billion in order to provide another bank, First Republic, with liquidity by depositing money in its vaults, presumably to keep the banking system afloat and keep First Republic solvent until it can be sold off. But the latest is that First Republic shares have dropped more than 20% today. The bailout has not calmed the fears. Initiated by Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan, and with the blessing of Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and Jay Powell, the Fed Chair, the banks JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and others rode to the rescue of First Republic. How altruistic of them. Or is the writing big on the wall? And how much of that money will end up being underwritten by the Fed if it does all go south? All while speculators are shorting banks across Europe and possibly wider. All because the rise in interest rates caused a drop in the value of the bonds that these banks hold as financial assets. And when depositors and investors get the idea that a bank's financial assets are devaluing, they get nervous and pull their money out. But this does affect all banks holding bonds. All of them. And the further interest rates go up to fight inflation, the worse it gets for the banks as the bonds drop in value. No wonder more of them are being shorted. And governments are still selling their country's debt bonds into the market, hoping the banks will snap them up. Will we be hearing of a First Republic sell-off over the weekend?